Hey folks, if you're a fan of Metroidvanias, Soulslikes, or perchance monster hunting, well, today's episode might be up your alley, and if you're a veteran of this channel, this review may feel overdue, given some of my earlier content. I say this because today I'm going to be delving into the review copy I received of Devoured Studios Salt and Sacrifice, the successor to Salt and Sanctuary. That said, there's some key differences at play this time around, enough to make it a notable departure from the previously established formula. Which means it's time to ask, was Sacrifice a magical experience, or did it defile Sanctuary's legacy in an insulting manner? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. Your crimes had promised you a brush with an executioner's axe, and yet another path availed itself. Your life would be spared where you'd become a marked inquisitor, a warrior dedicated to fighting the mages running amok in the world, doomed to never see his homelands again. And yet, to say this spares your life is perhaps a lie. In order to fulfill your duty, you're subjected to a rite that forces your body to revive after death, in a manner similar to the haze burnt, the corpses animated by your arcane prey, the mages. In all actuality, your existence is a protracted string of executions, with no real end in sight. But perhaps it needn't be that way. Perhaps if you can lay waste to the mages that stand in your path, you might be able to discover their secrets, or those of the kingdom you serve. That said, getting to the bottom of things can be a bit of a process. Part of this is simply due to the leisurely pace of the story, with the central narrative slowly fed to you through conversations with NPCs, both at the hub and abroad. That said, the central reason is that by and large, it requires the player to actively pursue it. Quite a few story threads require the player to actively seek out characters and help them along in each of the game's regions in order to get a bit more insight into the nature of the mages, their condition, and the world at large. And even then, the storytelling isn't quite as cut and dry as some might expect. In fact, there's a surprising amount of lore scrolled away in the oddest of places. Much in the same vein as Salt and Sanctuary, there's a chunk of backstory and context lodged in the game's skill tree, providing flavor and some neat little tidbits about the history of the world you exist in. There's also a substantial wealth of backstory just littered throughout the details of the various equipable and consumable items you can find. On the whole, if you're willing to do the legwork, there's a fair amount to soak in, and really, you should, since it does help to provide a bit more gravitas towards the final choice you're given between the game's two endings. Which, I should note, for the Sanctuary fans in the audience, does not entail permutations based on whatever faction you're associated with. But then, factions are also handled a bit differently this time around. Speaking of which, let's actually get into the mechanics here, because while there are certainly similarities between this title and its predecessor, Sacrifice has intricacies that make it a far departure from what many expected. But let's start with the familiar elements first. On the Souls-like side of things, this feels similar to Sanctuary, as players need to navigate a highly lethal world with limited healing resources, the rigors of stamina-based combat, as well as that classic harbinger of dread, the death penalty. I nearly said gravity there. Admittedly, it's a little bit more forgiving this time around, since you don't empower the enemy that killed you proportionately to the salt you dropped, or in the case of a brush with gravity, you don't spawn a murderous bat enemy, whose health and damage scales proportionate to the salt you dropped. Now there's just a pile to collect. Admittedly, this pile can spawn in some pretty unfortunate places, say the middle of a collapsing platform, guarded by a blade trap over a bottomless pit. Thank you, Hallowed Hill! Still, it's by and large kinder, which is more than I can say about your defense. See, while the game still has its fast-paced combat and the simple yet solid movesets for its myriad weapon types, there's a rather distinct change to your arsenal that's hard to miss. Notably, you can no longer parry for an immediate stun and repost opportunity. Instead, things veer closer towards the Sekiro style of combat offensive options, as you need to perfectly execute blocks in order to gradually drain enemies' poise and open them up for a dagger counterattack. While this sounds like it could be cool in execution, there's a few caveats such as an inability to see how much your little poison enemy has, and for anything beyond trash mobs, that can entail a considerable number of consecutive perfect blocks, all while trying to avoid getting guard crushed when you could just stab them. That's not to say this mechanic should be ignored though, since Perfect Block does negate stamina loss and can help contend with some of the cheesier range spamming bosses that Sacrifice has in store for the player. I mean, you do have a dodge still, but there's a few bosses that can attack so relentlessly that you'll rapidly drain your stamina in no time if your equip load even gives you the necessary iframes or recovery time to survive. Still, for a game that has you leaning so heavily on blocks, it's a little bit weird that the existence of shields has been folded into a single weapon type. The Vanguard, whose main claim to fame is a bit more of a forgiving block window. Speaking of weapon types though, if you were a fan of the movesets that they had in Sanctuary, you won't actually be disappointed here. Like before, each weapon has a surprisingly wide gamut of moves to be figured out, and some being as simple as alternating heavy and light attacks or aerial variants, while others require the addition of directional inputs. On the whole, I found myself thoroughly enjoying the way older weapons like whips had their moves expanded, as well as the process of figuring out how to use the newer weapons, like the high blades. God, I love high blades. Or the comparatively complex rapier. Though sometimes I'd just go for the one that gave me a running kick because it's really satisfying to send an enemy sailing off a cliff with the smug knowledge that gravity cuts both ways. There's just one thing here. While I've certainly talked about how a number of movesets were improved, this came at a cost. The overall inability to use shields on most characters is because Salt and Sacrifice removed the offhand slot. Something which also translates to the removal of one-handed and two-handed combat stances. Admittedly, the existing skill set meant this wasn't a big deal to me, except in one instance. Those stylish longsword and pistol combos are gone. No more dishing out a quick combo and then using a thunderous gunshot to launch yourself back out of a boss's attack range. In fact, pistols are entirely gone from the game, and ranged weapons at large now serve a more supplemental role, given that they have vastly lowered ammo that needs to be increased by finding certain items, and which can only really be reloaded either by taking a few moments to batchcraft a lot of them, or seeking out a checkpoint. While you can technically do the former during a boss fight, it's pretty slow by default, and getting that window necessary to take advantage of it also means forgoing actually stabbing the boss. It also fails to replenish your consumables, unlike visiting a checkpoint, and let me tell you, I needed those during the hunts, but we'll get to that. Anyways, while these adjustments are certainly interesting, perhaps the biggest change to combat is how Sacrifice addressed its magic system. Rather than needing to learn individual spells akin to Sanctuary, all of the game's magic is instead tied to the various weapons you'll be crafting, all of which are thematic to the bosses who served as its parts. While this is nice enough for providing casters with a broad array of spells to pull from, and thus the ability to always be relevant during a boss encounter, what I found particularly rewarding were the weapon buff spells, given they generally required a very minimal investment in the associated skill, while still providing the maximum amount of bonus given they scaled off the weapons themselves. And it's actually really neat since a number of the buffs can change up how the weapons work in subtle ways, such as the time buff, which can create not only a zone of slowing that can influence bosses, but also creates phantom slashes moments after you swung, which increases its range and its ability to suppress enemies. Other options can be a bit more straightforward, such as providing an elemental boost that enables you to pile out damage even if an enemy tries to block your fence through dots, or just by changing your type. It's really neat in practice, and frankly, given that the game is still using the skill tree and retains the ability to refund any non-skill nodes if you have the resource for it, I found syncing a point in the relevant skill always felt worthwhile because of how early on you can get it. And that's really nice, even for a melee-focused character. Now, if only you could level these up anywhere other than the central hub, which, on that note, it's time to talk about the exploration in Salt and Sacrifice, and it's interesting. As far as the layout of the world goes, rather than a singular interconnected map, you instead start out in a hub which grants you access to your first area, a somewhat sprawling biome to explore, which eventually provides you with the runes you'll need to access the next biome from the hub. Basically, this is a formula that you'll rinse and repeat across all of the game's various areas. Now, while this might sound a bit linear, I will admit that I found myself backtracking a fair bit because usually a good chunk of each area was optional to explore, and tied to the abilities that gradually appear later on. which, if you are a fan of platforming exploring abilities in Sanctuary, well... So, you do get to start out with the wall jump, which is pretty nice in and out of combat, as is unlimited sprint when not near enemies. That said, the ensuing abilities you accrue are a bit more of a mixed bag, given they're largely relegated to exploration rather than any real combat capacity. Suffice to say, you don't have an air dash anymore, which removes a lot of the mobility you had in Sanctuary. In fact, of the 3 tools you do grab, only one of them is really viable to use during a fight actively, since the grappling hook lets you quickly zip around to set up an area attack, to escape an unfortunate situation, or even to avoid death by gravity, but only so long as there's a contextual grapple point, which is to say, even with its utility, it's still fairly limited during proper boss fights, save for a certain fight built around it, and the occasional contextual face stabs you can trigger if you stagger a mage. It is 100% satisfying, though, to grapple onto a mage's face and stab them. As for the rest, well, you'll strictly see them put to use for advancing your exploration or expanding your ability to backtrack. That's not to say there isn't some interesting segments where they'll all be used together, but it definitely feels like a missed opportunity. Also, I'm a little bit sad that the cloth/parachute-ish tool can't be used to partly mitigate falling damage instead of leaving you to plunge to your death a la Wile E. Coyote if you aren't near their contextual windstream. Just awkward. Still, perhaps not quite as awkward as the way this intersects with the mage hunts. Okay, so one of the other bits of gating you'll encounter during your journey are mage doors. In order to open these, you need to track down a named mage, beat them up, and devour their heart. Which sounds simple enough until you realize the central element. They're not bound to an arena. Hunt is an extremely accurate term since these bastards are constantly on the move and have the nasty habit of populating the world with haze-burnt zombies while they're around, as well as summoning thematic monsters to make your life miserable. Oh, and did I mention they have the nasty habit of teleporting away, dropping ads, and then doing it again? How about their habit of venturing off to the other end of a platforming segment, waiting until you arrive, and then teleporting back? At least the game's kind enough to give you a visual indicator of which direction they fucked off to. It just doesn't do anything to stop them from loitering in a spot where they take up half the available floor space, and you're flanked by an abyssal plunge worthy of a Disney death scene. Which absolutely sucks, given that the later ones are more than capable of mulching you in a few hits if you're not in heavy armor, and still pretty capable even then. Frankly, it was often a relief when they decide to stop running and throw down for real. Like, sure, the title drop is a bit intimidating, and yes, the expanded moveset can be a bit of a problem, but A, they're generally not spawning minions anymore, and B, all the damage you've dealt during the hunt carries over to the fight, and it doesn't go away even if you die or use a checkpoint, which, yes, is why it's viable to stop at one to reload your ammo and consumables mid-chase. And in case you're wondering, this does translate to being able to drop a mage before the intended final showdown if your DPS is high enough. It's not exactly easy though, especially as you progress, since killing named mages causes roaming ones to begin spawning. And there's absolutely nothing stopping from one of these mages from popping over mid-hunt to make an absolute mess of things. Like, they'll fight each other, sure, but they'll both be throwing projectiles all over the place and summoning in clusterfucks of enemies you'll need to navigate, and you can even have another one crash the party, so while your party is getting crashed, you can get a third one. Oh, and while you're actually fighting them in the proper last stand boss fight, they can still crash the party and show up if they're nearby. It is awkward as hell at times, especially if they decide to meander to a spot that's far enough that you can't bully them into leaving, but close enough that they can cast spells and summon garbage. The occasional stupid death from this made me unfathomably grateful for the fast travel network in each region, even if they are somewhat limited to just a few contextual locations. Oh, and by the way, all of this about mages? This isn't even the whole of it, since there's 2 more classes of mages to bump into, the Fated and the Nameless. The Nameless are essentially upgraded variants of the base mages who tend to have meaner versions of their skill set, both in the sense that they're sped up, as well as certain relentlessness leading them to spamming abilities. There's very little room to breathe and counterattack in some of these encounters. That said, they do provide decent rewards compared to their vanilla peers in the form of salt, drops, a nifty headpiece for stats and fashion, and access to consumable items which are surprisingly complementary to your skill set. Being able to trade HP for more mana or rage is really nice, as is the elemental infusion claws, which let you imbue non-elemental weapons. And this one really helps, since a number of weapons never gain certain elemental variants. If you're willing to put in the work to take down a Nameless, they're actually a really nice alternative. As for the Fated, they're essentially daily raids you can engage with. They're generally pretty dangerous, but again, they're a great source of salt and upgrade materials. And, well, you just need so many materials. Whether it's your armor, your weapons, or your accessories, the lion's share of what you'll be using is crafted from mage parts, and this tends to entail killing them a couple times to get everything you need. Hell, even ignoring armor, crafting the weapons is always beneficial given just how useful elemental damage is in the game, as well as gaining access to their runic arts. I fucking love those things. That said, I'd also highly recommend paying close attention to the accessories, since they add a lot of oomph to your kit and some great options for survivability and offense. And they're a lot more dependable than the relics, which... Okay, so I hated the charm system in Monster Hunter World. There was something personally galling to me that I need to farm monsters over and over again in order to get an item and to pray that it had the substats I needed to round out my kit. And well, relics are basically just accessories that function like charms. Trinkets that bosses randomly drop, albeit split into offense, defense, and support types. Which for better or worse, you can equip one of each. Here's the thing though. You only get one per boss, their rarity is arbitrary, which influences how many substats they get, and their strength can be lackluster even when killing higher level mages. Oh, and before you get the bright idea to use the merchant that lets you air quote bolster and air quote a relic and empower it, yes, this increases the level of the relic and technically the strength capacity of the substats on it, but it also re-rolls every fucking stat on it. So if you had somehow got a godly combination of extra attack speed, and something like increased melee range and mage damage, or, you know, all of the above, which happened once, that's gone now. There's no way to lock any of those stats or to craft a talisman focusing on just one of those stats. I have farmed so many relics, and the process of getting what I wanted feels cursed at times. To get a singular relic that I wanted that met my criteria on the character that I'm playing as for my melee build, I got that one item after I screwed up that first one after 74 hours. So, I mean, yeah, that's also my fault for trying to pursue, I guess, attack speed, attack range, attack, and mage damage. But, like, even then, I only wanted 3 of those on one item. I only wanted 3 of them. You know what? It's not like I had to farm alone, because if there's one thing that Salt and Sacrifice has made infinitely better than its predecessor, it's the multiplayer. Like, first off, on the cooperative side, there's a lot more options now. For those who are cozy at home, couch co-op is still available, providing players with a solid co-op buddy that doesn't despawn from the world when killed, and even provides them a means of being revived without setting the world's progress. This also means you're perfectly positioned to just sit there and bask in the sight of your friend getting pelted off the side of a cliff and plunging to their death. That said, this is also now available to online players. Just go over to the co-op board in the hub and you can drag in a constant companion who'll stick around even after you've killed a boss. It's absolutely lovely and has the side benefit of being accessible even if you chose to avoid dealing with other forms of jolly cooperation, or potential PvP. Because, well, it's definitely there. If you're so inclined, you can light a candle in order to invite one of the myriad factions to join your session, or to attempt joining someone else's. Admittedly, inviting a co-op member does open you up to an invasion regardless, but given that you can password even your online sessions, this isn't too bad. Also, given there's several co-op factions, a wildcard faction, and the ability to drag in a permanent co-op buddy into the mix, you have a wonderful recipe for complete clusterfucks of sessions. Especially if you get a blue heart runner, given the little bastards can run around the map and make life hell for you indirectly, by causing powerful enemies to spawn. It's absolutely fabulous and a very different way at taking a PvP/PvE faction, and frankly, if that sounds interest you either for them or for anything else, the official Ska Studios Discord made coordinating larger scale nonsense pretty accessible on the whole, especially if I wanted to use network passwords to limit things to just friends and acquaintances. It's good. And speaking of good, I really love the visuals in this game. The bestiary is incredibly fun to face off against with a lot of new friends, even if others are directly ported over from Sanctuary, such as the Alchemist, who's gone from a big bad boss to an itty bitty mook. That said, the real showstopper on that front is, as ever, the bosses. In and of themselves, the mages feel distinct enough from each other, but as you get further into the game, you start to encounter some really neat ones, such as the Lumomancer and Umbramancer. They're creepy and surreal to look at, the minions they summon up are wild. It's great stuff, really. As is your capacity to engage in the time-honored tradition of Fashion Souls. I bumped off a few bosses just to get a brand new fit, and I'll wholly confess that while I love my late game weapons for their utility, they also happen to be really swanky looking. Seriously, these two high blades look absolutely stellar, and I love them to pieces for their aesthetic alone. That said, as nice as these elements are, they pale in regards to the area design itself. There is something just nice about the world, as gloomy as moody as it may be. If you take the time to just stop and soak things in, there's a lot of neat little details, whether strictly for the sake of ambience or for bits of environmental storytelling. In fact, I'm very partial to the fourth area in that regards, because while there's certainly a sense of majesty to the snowy mountainside you ramp up, and the temple that lays before you, there's also something interesting about the enemies you encounter. Namely, that you'll find quite a few peacefully meditating. It definitely changes things up a bit, since you wind up feeling less like a hero liberating an area from mages, and more like an interloper, or perhaps an invader, which is rather befitting for an inquisitor. Really, I should probably feel worse about this, but well, Sacrifice still has some solid tracks to listen to, which means it's really easy to get distracted from any morally questionable actions you might be taking, as long as there's a bombastic boss-related banger playing in the background. In any case, now seems as good as a time as any to sit down and sum all this up, and, well, I enjoyed myself. As far as revisiting the world of Salt, I think it provided some interesting new tidbits to chew on and helped to expand the narrative of the first game. Admittedly, the movement doesn't feel quite as dynamic as its predecessor, and I certainly felt more limited insofar as my combat mobility, but there are some satisfying obstacle segments that at least make good use of the traversal tools you're granted. As for the combat, I appreciate the majority of the changes. Like, yes, I do miss the parry, but the accessibility of the runic arts added so much flexibility to the combat options both for PvE and PvP. The buffs always felt useful, and while a weapon might struggle at one juncture, it was sure to excel somewhere else. Also, on a strictly character building level, it was really nice that split stat weapons were still quite viable without an excessive amount of points. Really, if I had to pinpoint the biggest hurdle for me, it was more a matter of the mages themselves. Some of them spawned some absolutely obnoxious minions, like say, teleporting vampires, and there's not much to stop them from invoking a small flash mob of them if you're not able to chase them away in a timely fashion. Pair that with the occasional decision to flit off to grossly inconvenient locations, and what's intended to be an epic chase becomes more of a slog, or a disaster that should have the Benny Hill theme playing during it. The nameless fights too can also wind up feeling a bit cheap at times, but I still found them quite doable even if I was venturing on my own. A bit of a big if there, by the by, since this game absolutely shines when you have someone to play it with. Sure, the enemies get a bit beefier with a dedicated player too, but there's just something great about flanking an enemy while you're throwing down or setting up complementary weapon sets with your runic arts in mind. Or, again, laughing at your friend when they trigger a trap and just go flying right over your head. What's more, I found myself ecstatic because when I was making story progress with someone in co-op, it counted for both of us instead of just favoring the host. Like, yes, if you're coming here looking for a fairly straightforward Salt and Sanctuary sequel, this might not fit the bill for you, but it was never intended to be. It's a separate beast, a weird Souls-likey Metroidvania Monster Hunter mashup, and even with the nitpicks I have, I'm still keen to play more, even after these 74 hours. In fact, I am looping back around in New Game Plus on one of my characters, though the health and damage scaling on enemies is brutal. So yeah, I can safely call this game a very strong example of a hit. P.S. The free DLC area that was added to the game, Heart of Alterstone, is definitely a neat addition. A little bit brutal if you go there the moment you can, but it's quite good. What's more, beyond having a fairly expansive area to explore and more story tidbits, it also provides access to a randomized boss rush, which you can continually scale up in difficulty. It's great if you need materials to craft all the boss trophies necessary to pimp out your tent. Anywho, thanks for tuning in! If you have something to say, leave a comment, and if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description, and check out my Patreon to see reviews early and support the channel, like Shrimp Mania, Greenwich Babby, and Andy Noted. Also, I do have a merch house with neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs and shirts. That said, I'll catch you in the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.